Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, IESBA, on its recent revisions to the definitions of listed entity and public interest entity in the code. We are very pleased that you can join us today. And my name is Geoff Kwan, and I'm a director with the IESBA and also staff support for the IESBA Pi project. And I will be moderating the webinar today. And of course, today we're very pleased to have Andrew Mintzer and Michael Ashley as our presenters. I have the pleasure of working with both Andy and Mike on a number of IESBA projects and work streams, including, of course, the Pi project. Let me first just give you a brief introduction of our speakers. Andrew is from the United States, and he was appointed to the IESBA board as a board member since 2018. He is licensed to practice in both the US and Canada, and his CPA career has spanned over 40 years. Hard to believe because it looks like he's only 40 years old. He is a principal at Hemming Morse, focusing on forensic accounting services. And previously, he was an audit partner with EY and has served on 3 US standard setting bodies with the AICPA, the Professional Ethics Executive Committee, the Auditing Standards Board, and Accounting Standards Executive Committee. Andy has also joined the AICPA's Board of Directors as of 2021, and he was also a former California Society of CPA's chairman. Andy was a member of the IESBA Pi Task Force and is currently our Pi Rollout Working Group Chair as well. And he's also a task force member of our Tax Planning Task Force. Today, joining us also is Mike Ashley from the United Kingdom. Mike was an IESBA member from 2016 to 2021. And currently, Mike is a non-executive director of Barclays in the UK and also is audit committee chair. Before joining the Barclays board, Mike was a partner with KPMG and spent most of his audit career mainly involved in audits of major banking institutions. Mike also currently serves as a member of the UK Endorsements Board, the UK Cabinet Office Board, and also it's the chair of its Audit and Risk Committee, and a member of the ICAEW Ethics Standards Committee. He was also chair of the UK Government Internal Audit Agency, the Audit Committee of UK Treasury, the UK Accounting Standards Board, chair of the Policy and Guidance Committee of the Charity Commission of England and Wales. I believe Mike is also currently still the treasury of the Scouts Association, so he finds some to do that as well. Mike was the IESBA Pi Task Force chair, and he had been also involved in a number of projects whilst he was on the board, including the PASI project. He was the chair of that and was also task force member of the fees project. So welcome, Andy and Mike, to the webinar. If I can turn to the next page, please. I can't really see the screen. Here it is. Thanks, Diana. Thank you for that. I just want to quickly run you through our agenda today. First, we want to just give you a bit of the background of the Pi project. And then we're going to explain to you the overall framework of how the IESBA develops its Pi, revised Pi definition. And then we're going to go straight to some of the key revisions to the code. And then we're going to walk you through the effective date and a number of upcoming rollout activities. And we're going to give you an opportunity to give us some questions, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. Just on the questions, you will notice that at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A option. If you want to type your questions at any time, we will collect those and we will read out some of those and allow Mike and Andy an opportunity to respond to them. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Andy, who's going to start with a background to the Pi project. So thanks, Andy.
Sure, thanks, Geoff. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So first, good day, everybody. First, some background, as was discussed. The Pi concept, public interest entity concept, was first introduced into the Extant Code when IESBA finalized its independent project in early 2000s. At that time, IESBA concluded that other than for listed entities, determining which entities should be treated as public interest entities should largely be left to local regulators or other authorities. But in recent years, there has been a lot of comments raised as to whether this definition was sufficiently clear and functional. For instance, we've heard from some regulatory stakeholders about re-examining the definition from the perspective of financial institutions. The IESBA also recognized that a number of jurisdictions have expanded their local Pi definition for purposes of independence, notably among these South Africa, Singapore, Australia. There is therefore a need to understand the commonalities and the differences between those jurisdictional approach and the one taken in our code, and whether there would be improvement in expanding the Pi definition at the global level to achieve a greater convergence at a global level, as well as consider the public interest. With regard to the definition of listed entities, some stakeholders have also questioned whether the term recognized stock exchange in the Extant Code is the same as regulated market in the EU definition. Against all this background, the IESBA agreed to explore the definitions of listed entity and Pi in the current cycle, in our current work plan cycle. And in light of the progress with the non-assurance services and the fees projects, which have recently been issued, that have many requirements that are focused on auditors of PIs, the board agreed to fast track the Pi project and commence actually over a year ahead of schedule. The public interest objectives of the Pi project are to provide greater clarity and guidance to the concepts, scope in the right entities in the public interest to be subject to the additional requirements, specifically for NAS and fee provisions, NAS, non-assurance services, and other parts of the code that focus on public interest entities, and seek alignment with the terms and concepts between IESBA and the IAASB to the greatest extent possible. Can I have the next slide, please? So just again, as for the background, this is showing the timeline. The project commenced in January 2020, and you'll note that an exposure draft was released in January 2021. So our Pi task force that Mike chaired started just before the lockdown. We managed to get one meeting in prior to the lockdown face-to-face in London, but the rest of this project took place virtually at all hours of the day throughout the globe with the task force as well as the IESBA. After the exposure draft was released, we received 69 comment letters, and 7 of the comment letters came from regulators, included one from a monitoring group member, IOSCO. We've also received comments from the public sector organizations and from preparers and for those charged with governance. During this whole project, the IESBA, as usual, sought views from its consultative advisory, the CAG, and has taken their feedback into consideration. The CAG is broadly represented by not only the profession, but also regulators and investment groups. The IESBA also met with a number of key stakeholders, including the Committee on Issuer Accounting, Audit and Disclosure, Committee 1, on a number of occasions, as well as the PILB. The IESBA also has very close coordination with its sibling board, the IAASB, throughout the project. We had correspondent members on the task force to make sure that matters of mutual interest are identified and addressed, and the IESBA is on board with the IASB rather is on board with the IESBA's proposals. And for those of you who are following the work of the IAASB, the Audit Insurance Standards Board, you know that it has just approved a project proposal for a narrow scope maintenance of standards project to address a number of IAASB related matters. And I'd encourage you to follow the progress, which is divided into 2 tracks, and provide feedback to the extent you would like on that. May I have the next slide, please? Our new IESBA chair, who has assumed duties this year, the concept of PI is central to the application of international independent standards, and determines how far an auditor must go in meeting the fundamental requirement to be independent. The revised definition and related provisions represent the 3rd pillar in our package of measures to significantly strengthen auditor independence in the public interest, following the release of our revised non-assurance services and fee standards this year. Those are the overarching words of IESBA Chair Gabriella. And during a recent, during our current strategy period, the IESBA continued to place high priority on strengthening the international independent standards. And we had these 3 interconnected projects that you see here: the non-assurance services, the fee project, and the PI project. And we'll see how all of these enhanced provisions will work together. Now let's go through some of the key components of the PI revisions, and I'm going to pass it along to the PI Task Force Chair, Mike Ashley, as we go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome everyone. This overall diagram, which does feature in the basis of conclusions as well, so hopefully is not news to anybody, is really just designed to set out the schematic, if you like, as to how the task force approached it. And we will go through each of the bits in turn, but just in brief, first and foremost, there is an overarching objective. Why are we doing this in the first place? What is the intent behind having additional requirements for auditors of entities which are regarded as PIs? Also, in looking at the PI definition, IESBA recognized very early in the process the importance of local bodies in defining what is a PI in their local context. It's very difficult to come up with a global definition that is universally applicable. So there is a top-down list of what we regard as mandatory high-level categories, which we do anticipate need to be refined at the local level in order to make them operable. Although in adopting those revisions, just to be clear, the IESBA is not expecting any of these mandatory PI categories to be wholesale deleted. In addition to the top-down list, the IESBA was also conscious that, as has already been indicated, a number of jurisdictions have already gone further than IESBA had done, or indeed does do in terms of the mandatory lists here, in adopting PI categories for its local purposes. So we've built into it very strongly the requirement for local bodies to consider and add on to the list based on their local circumstances. And to complete the framework, firms are also being encouraged to determine whether there are additional entities which may, possibly for idiosyncratic reasons, be regarded as PIs in their local context. Next slide, please. So if we start with the overarching objective, as I said, the IESBA took the view that very early on we needed to have a purpose behind this, and we needed to be very clear what that purpose was. And therefore we needed to be clear about what the objective was of defining a class of entities for which additional independence requirements would be required. That overarching objective is also designed to help local bodies in thinking about what entities they should actually refine the list down to and what entities they might add when thinking about it in their local context. And 400.8 and 400.9 explain the overarching objective. And I'm not going to go through those in details, but basically we are looking at the significant public interest in the financial condition of an entity, and I'll explain that in a minute, which leads, in our view, to heightened stakeholder expectations on the independence of the firm when conducting the audit. And that's why we set the additional requirements, in other words, to meet those expectations. And turning to public interest in financial condition, because financial condition is not a term generally used in the code, it was used very deliberately. What we meant by that was something broader than just the financial statements. And we did that quite deliberately because we felt that this was more to do with the overall financial well-being of an organization. That's what drives the public interest. It doesn't change the auditor's responsibilities in relation to the financial statement, but it's what drives the public interest, and it's wider than just what happens to appear in its financial statements. We did think, however, that it should be on the general financial health of an entity. So it's not just, is it financial failure? It is also whether it's financial success. So are enough stakeholders intimately concerned about or involved in some way, such that there is significant public interest in that financial condition? And you'll see we've also tried to elaborate what we mean by that by talking about the potential impact of financial well-being on stakeholders in paragraph 400.8. As I said, we didn't feel it was appropriate just to narrow it to financial statements. We do also acknowledge there may be significant public interest in other aspects of an entity, such as the quality of the services it provides, for example, if it's a hospital, or the nature of the data it might hold and the susceptibility of that data to be leaked. But given that Part 4A of the code, which is what we are concerned with here, deals with audits and reviews of financial statements, IESBA was very strongly of the view that these other drivers of public interest should not form part of the overarching objective for additional independence requirements for the financial statement auditors. We did also hear about, in that context, we heard from some stakeholders about expanding the focus to include consideration of non-financial information. And we're very conscious of the growth in the focus on sustainability reporting and assurance that has occurred over the last few years and continues to develop. However, again, at present, the international independence standards within Part 4A deal with the audits and reviews of financial statements and not other assurance requirements. As and when those develop, I'm sure that IESBA will be looking at, and I'm very conscious there is an ongoing project on sustainability more generally, but they will be looking at what that means in terms of the independence requirements and whether there are times when those independence requirements need to be enhanced. Paragraph 400.10 also talks about the focus of the independence requirements should be on meeting stakeholders' heightened expectations. Those heightened expectations, in our view, arise due to the public interest and the impact on the public, both in the event of financial success and, probably more importantly in this context, the event of financial failure. And therefore, it's felt that additional independence requirements are necessary in areas such as fees, provision of non-audit services, and long association in order to meet those heightened expectations. It doesn't mean, however, that those auditors are somehow more or indeed less independent than auditors of non-PIs. It's just that they feel like there is more of an expectation of how they demonstrate that. Next slide, please. .9 does contain a non-exhaustive list of 6 factors as guidance, both to firms in thinking about their requirements, but also more importantly to local bodies when evaluating the nature of public interest and the extent of public interest in financial condition of an entity. I don't propose to go through each of the factors in detail, but just to make a few points. Firstly, they are not designed to be treated in isolation. They are designed to be treated in aggregate. All of these may be important. Indeed, there may be others that in particular circumstances are equally important. But factor 1 is really pertinent as far as financial institutions are concerned, which obviously there are in various circumstances significant public interest. Factor 2 is also picks up a number of financially regulated institutions, but it was deliberately drawn wider than just financial regulation, as there may be other regulated entities, again, where that supervision is designed to give some confidence that the entity is going to meet its financial obligations. So, for example, that could be utilities, it could be financial infrastructure. Factor 3 is drawn from, i.e. size of the entity, is drawn from the extant code. And clearly it's viewed both from the perspective excluding very small entities that might otherwise get caught, but also from the perspective of considering that very large entities, just by size alone, and therefore the impact that it might have on the number of stakeholders who would be involved, might qualify to be regarded as significant public interest. The importance of the entity to the sector in which it operates was really designed to pick up those entities for which, if there was financial failure, and I stress financial failure rather than operational failure, but if there was financial failure, that would be a problem in the sense of they would not be easily replaced, at least in the short term. So again, if you have a utility monopoly operating in a particular marketplace and its failure would cause problems for all its consumers, that would pick that up. The fifth factor is really designed to pick up the direct impact on stakeholders. So looking at the number and nature of stakeholders, and we've again tried to draw that widely. So it's not just investors, it is customers, it is creditors, it is employees. And the last one is to consider that even over and above that, it may be that they have a systemic impact on the economic system of the country as a whole, or the state as a whole, depending upon what is the context that you are looking at this in. So that is really the design of the 6 factors. If we can go on to the next slide. So the PIE definition now has got 3 mandatory categories. Publicly traded entity, which has been designed deliberately to be somewhat wider and to replace the old definition of listed entity, deposit-taking institutions, and insurers. As I've said before, when we developed the proposed categories, we already took into account what other people had done, and therefore these were very much based on categories which had already been identified as PIEs in a number of jurisdictions. And equally, we excluded from our consideration those which have clearly been designated as PIEs by some jurisdictions, but very much in a local context. The ED, when we first brought it out, had proposed 2 additional mandatory categories: post-employment benefits and collective investment vehicles. The board did agree to remove those 2 categories in the final approved version, for which Andy will explain the rationale later. As part of the ED, we did also ask about entities that are raising funds through less conventional forms of capital raising, such as initial coin offerings. The overwhelming feedback, though, from respondents to the ED was that the decision to scope in such entities would be best made at a local level, as the relevant local bodies are better placed to make the necessary judgments at this stage of the early development of these sorts of markets. We also acknowledge that some entities raising funds may already meet the definition of publicly traded entity. We do feel that the revised PIE definition is raising the bar significantly at a global level. The extant definition only has 1 mandatory category and doesn't automatically include financial institutions. And therefore, we do believe that the revised definition is going to create a greater level of uniformity across the globe regarding the types of entities that should be PIEs. Whilst there are a number of jurisdictions, such as the EU, that have already expanded their list of PIEs for independence purposes, there are still many jurisdictions that only have listed entities as their 1 category. For these jurisdictions, we think this will substantially strengthen the code as they adopt the IESBA's PIE definition. What we have also done in R400.18 is require the firms to take into account more explicit definitions provided by local law, regulation, or professional standards. We were very conscious that in signing the 3 categories that we have got, they are drawn very widely. And we do think that local bodies are going to have to refine them, as I've said, in order to exclude things which would not logically meet a definition of a public interest entity based on our overriding objective. An example would be, for example, credit unions, which are often excluded because of their size, despite the fact that they would meet the definition of a deposit-taking institution. Also, when we looked at it, we were conscious of the fact that some other types of entity might be designated as of being of public interest. That is a term which might be regarded as more use than just in terms of independent standards. So we have said that if different terms are used by law or regulation to meet our objective, then those should be regarded as pies. But equally, if somebody says something is a pie, but it's clearly intended for some purpose other than to meet our objective, that does not make them a pie as far as we are concerned for the code. And finally, I just wanted to reiterate that we're not expecting local bodies to remove an entire pie category. And finally, as we said here, and in conformance with the extant code, other entities which are specified by local law, regulation, or professional standards to meet our overriding purpose will indeed be treated as pies. We can go on to the next page, please. So, as I've said, in refining at local level, we do expect local bodies to play a very significant role within our overall code. We decided very early on that if we were going to expand beyond listed entity, we would not be able to come up with something which was globally applicable. And we were very conscious, for example, that when we looked at the EU definitions, not only were there differing carve-outs for different countries even within the EU, but the whole basis of their definition, for example, for deposit-taking institutions, rested on a local law definition of what a deposit-taking institution was, which we obviously can't use because there is no globally accepted definition of what that is. Therefore, although we did acknowledge that there was a concern amongst some stakeholders that we should try and come up with a baseline definition, we determined, and we, even following the responses to the ED, we continued to determine that that was not practicable. In those circumstances, we felt, therefore, the only alternative was to allow the code to deviate from its normal practice and allow the relevant local bodies to determine within that broad categorization that I've been through, which entities were excluded that the code would otherwise include. And the rationale for that is it has to be determined within the local context. It cannot be determined on a global basis. Paragraphs 418A1 and A2 provided some guidance, both to firms, but also, as importantly, to local bodies. Whilst the code is a set of standards of ethical behaviour expected of professional accountants, and it has no legal or other authority over those local bodies, we felt it would be important and helpful to include some clear messages and expectations. And therefore, these two paragraphs send a strong signal to those local bodies that regarding their role in refining the pie definition to try and ensure that the right entities are captured as pies and for the appropriate independence requirements to be applied. So 418A1 provides some guidance on how to more explicitly define the mandatory categories, making reference, for example, to specific public markets for trading securities. As I've indicated, saying things like, are credit unions, depending upon their size, something which should be included depending upon the local context. And again, some countries have more significant credit unions or mutual insurers, which is the other one which is carved out, for example, in a number of countries within the EU, than others. And therefore, it's appropriate that those are defined at that local level. 418A2 also indicates the sorts of entities that one might think about when a local body was adding additional categories. So, for example, again, in some countries, defined benefit pension schemes are more important than in other countries. Some countries may have large private entities, which even though investors are not affected by their financial condition. Other stakeholders, in particular customers and employees, might be. And of course, public utilities is the other one. I'm now going to pass back to Andy to take us through the PI definition.
Thanks, Mike. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so now let's do a deeper dive in some of the concepts that Mike just introduced in the PI definition, specifically paragraph R 400.17. And let's start with A, publicly traded entity. Publicly traded entity as a mandatory PI category is a new term in the code. And the definition is on the screen: an entity that issues financial instruments that are transferable and traded through a publicly accessible market mechanism, including through listing on a stock exchange. And then it goes on to say further, a listed entity as defined by relevant securities law or regulation is an example of a publicly traded entity. This term, publicly traded entity, is intended to scope in more entities because it is not limited to shares, stock, or debt traded in formal exchange or on the primary market. The new term replaces the term listed entity, but to express the views that listed entity is a well-established term, the IESBA agreed to incorporate the concept of listed entity into the publicly traded entity definition, as I just read, by including the phrase, including through listing on a stock exchange. This phrase is intended to include not only primary stock exchanges, but also other exchanges, such as second-tier exchanges when used for trading by the public. And also by attaching the explanatory sentence that I read, that a listed entity as defined by relevant security law or regulation is an example of a publicly traded entity. Therefore, any entities that are listed entities in their local jurisdictions will also be scoped in as public interest entities, as long as those entities also meet the criteria set out in the publicly traded entity definition. The withdrawal of the extant definition of listed entity is consistent with IESBA's overall approach of using high-level definitions and its view that local bodies are best placed to refine the PI definition as part of their adoption process. A couple of additional items here. The phrase traded through publicly accessible market mechanism means the trading of an entity's financial instruments should be through a facilitated trading platform that's available to the public. Such mechanism can be either a primary or second-tier stock exchange or over-the-counter platform. However, it is not intended to capture entities for which the only way to trade their financial instruments is through privately negotiated agreements. Further, an entity whose financial instruments are traded through over-the-counter platform by the public, even with low volume of trade, is, without refinement by a local body, a publicly traded entity. The IESBA has determined that the term financial instruments should also be broadly interpreted and subject to local refinement, instead of relying on the International Accounting Standards Board definition or otherwise defined in the code. So the term covers not only shares, stock, or debt, as currently used in the extant definition of listed entity, but also other types of instruments such as bonds, warrants, and hybrid securities. It is also sufficiently broad to cover any future developments in corporate fundraising. So we're not relying on a technical accounting definition. Doing so is a bit tricky because those accounting definitions do tend to change. So that's why the task force and ultimately the board went with the term I just referred to. The definition of publicly traded entity is intended to be high level and will scope in a broad range of entities. Any further refinement should be conducted by the local relevant bodies as appropriate depending upon the specific context, such as by reference to specific regulated or other exchanges. For instance, some jurisdictions might determine that entities trading via second-tier markets or over-the-counter platforms are not publicly traded entities, as the financial condition of these entities do not attract or represent significant public interest. And as Mike said, it was very difficult really impossible to set a global standard without refinement by the local bodies. As a part of its PI project, the IAASB will look into the use of listed entities in the international standards of international auditing standards and the quality control standards in light of the changes in our code of ethics. I encourage you, as I mentioned before, to check out their project webpage to find out more about their work. Next page, please. Okay, so now we have paragraphs R417, B and C, additional mandatory categories. Entities with deposit-taking and insurance businesses take on significant financial obligations to the public, both individuals and to corporate entities. And as a consequence of both taking on those obligations and the interconnectedness of the role they play in the financial markets, are generally subject to significant financial and prudential regulation and supervision at the local or national level. The phrase here, one of whose main functions in each B and C, is not only is meant to capture entities that have other main functions such as credit and lending, but also to exclude those entities for which deposit taking or insurance is not a main function. The reference to the public in these two categories should be broadly understood and need not be further explained in the code. Some jurisdictions might decide that because of the nature of the business, all banks or some banks or all credit unions or some credit unions or building societies or different types of institutions that are indigenous to different localities should be included as PIs regardless of size, while others might only include banks or further refine things based on size. Next slide, please. The IESBA had included, as Mike mentioned, post-employment benefits and common investment vehicles in the proposed list of mandatory PI categories in the exposure draft, taking into account the likelihood of these categories being adopted by most jurisdictions and the impact they can have on the public in the event of a financial failure. The IESBA had discussed at length about whether to retain these two proposed categories. In reviewing the comment letters, the comments received, and our outreach, the IESBA was considering whether it would be more appropriate to include them in the top-down mandatory list, or whether the IESBA should leave them for the local bodies to take them up as appropriate. Our board observed that the post-employment benefits and common investment vehicles are much more diverse in structure and size than, say, the other categories that are scoped in, such as banks and insurers. They are not as standardized as the banking and insurance industries, that is. The IESBA also conducted fact-finding into the PI definitions across jurisdictions. The results show that those jurisdictions with expanded PI definition will invariably have deposit taking and insurers, but the same cannot be said about post-employment benefits and common investment vehicles. The IESBA has looked at the risk of including them in the mandatory list versus allowing the local bodies to include them as additional categories. The IESBA also agreed that an additional holistic research is required to fully explore the issues relating to post-employment benefits and common investment vehicles, covering the role of administrators, trustees, managers, advisors, and including the concept of related entity. And we are taking that project on board. So in deciding to remove post-employment benefits and common investment vehicles from the list, the IESBA has also agreed to the new application material you'll find in 400.18A2 about local bodies adding new categories with examples. We will conduct this post-implementation review I just alluded to and initiate a holistic review into the two categories and their relationships with trustees, managers, and advisors. Next slide, please. So finally, onto R400.17D, additional PI categories. As mentioned by Mike earlier, firms are also required to treat other PI and other entities as PIs, other entities added by their local bodies in accordance with R400 17D. 417D is an entity specified as such by law, regulation, or professional standards to meet the purpose set out in 400.10. Paragraph 400.18A2, I believe I might have mentioned that earlier, highlights the expected role of the local bodies to add other categories as PIs, those entities with significant public interest in their local jurisdiction. And the paragraph does include some examples, such as that are listed here also on the slide: pension funds, collective or common investment vehicles, private entities with large number of stakeholders other than investors, not-for-profit organizations or government entities, and public utilities. When developing the exposure draft and when considering what categories of entities should be included in the proposed mandatory list, the IESBA had considered a wide range of the entities. Many of them I just mentioned, but others are also on the slide on the right. I want to reiterate that IESBA's view that the local bodies are best placed to determine which entities should be classified as PIs, entities that have the significant public interest in their area. I'd like to turn to the next slide, please, and turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Andy. In addition to the requirements on firms, there is also two further bits that we built into the code in terms of the role of the firms. One is, which in the original ED, as I'll come on to in a minute, was a requirement for the firm to determine whether any additional entities should be regarded as PIs. And the second one, which I'll discuss also in a second, was the requirement to be transparent about which entities were in fact treated as PIs. And the two of those were to some extent linked, or to a large extent linked. So in terms of the firm's role now as treating additional entities as PIs, as I said, the ED did originally build that in as a requirement. In the final pronouncement, having taken account of stakeholder views, IESBA determined that it would be more appropriate at this stage to revert that back to what is in effect the current code encouragement for firms to consider whether additional entities should be treated as PIs. I think there was a concern as to whether this would somehow subvert or change the role of local bodies in terms of their role in determining additional entities. It was never that intention, and I would say that both in terms of the original requirement and certainly in terms of this additional encouragement, it's really aimed at, I suppose, those types of entities which, more for idiosyncratic reasons, are very unlikely ever to be determined by a local body as a PI, but nonetheless, in sitting back and thinking about the overall objective, logically ought to be treated as a PI. The example I always gave during the course of the development of this was that in the UK, we had at one stage some companies that took money from customers during the course of the year and provided discounted vouchers at Christmas time so they could go out and buy Christmas goods. And clearly there was a very large proportion of quite vulnerable people within society who depended upon getting those Christmas vouchers back. And therefore there was quite a strong public interest in that type of entity. It was never going to be a category in its own right that somebody would be able to define. And therefore that's the sort of thing that certainly I had in mind when we were talking about encouraging the firms to think about entities which might be treated as PIs. As I say, we did put it down initially as a requirement, given all the other changes and everything else, and coupled with the transparency requirement, which I'll come on to, we were very comfortable to revert back at this stage to application material and make it more encouragement. We have, as part of that, actually in 400.1981, provided a list of the sorts of factors that, in addition to the general factors as to what makes a PI, that a firm might think about in treating a particular entity as a PI. So, for example, whether the entity is likely to become a public interest entity in the near future, and therefore it would be of an advantage both to the entity and to the auditors to start treating them like that as of now, to build up the public confidence in the financial statements, etc. Whether in similar circumstances, a predecessor firm has applied PI independence to the requirements would be something we would expect a firm to take into account. Not clearly something which is definitive, but certainly something to take into account. We did also think that there may be occasions when the firm or its stakeholders may wish to be treated as a PI in order to demonstrate that those enhanced independence standards were being applied by the firm in carrying out the audit. So we did build in that is another factor to take into account, bearing in mind that it, again, is not definitive as far as the firm is concerned. They need to consider whether it is appropriate to respond to that request or not. And in that context, also, we were very conscious that a number of the additional independence requirements that are applied to PIs under the code do require communication with those charged with governance. And therefore, you need to have regard to the corporate governance structure that the firm is operating under. We've kept all those factors at a fairly high level, and I don't propose to go through them in more detail now, but I do guide you to the ED and the basis of conclusions for any more information you want. We can go on to the next slide, please. And the last bit of this equation was around transparency. Given that the whole purpose of this is to enhance confidence and to meet stakeholder expectations, then it's obviously important that they understand which entities have been treated as PIs and which have not. And because the code is a single code, albeit with differing requirements for different types of entity, that is currently not completely clear. So we did believe it was important to have disclosure of where a firm has applied the independence requirements for a PI to an audit. That disclosure, we have said, has to be in a manner deemed appropriate, taking into account the timing and accessibility of information to the stakeholders. In looking at what is appropriate, again, you have to consider what, in fact, access stakeholders have, either to the audit report, because, again, there's not much point in building in expectations of the independence of auditors if they haven't even seen the results of that audit work, or indeed the financial statements. So that is one key element, I suppose, that you've got to have almost from the get-go. We also agreed that we would not at the moment look to define strictly what we felt was appropriate. As Andy and Geoff, I think, have already alluded to, the IEESB PI project is exploring disclosure in the audit report as part of its fast track. And depending upon the outcome of that project, we will then consider whether further action is needed, either to provide additional guidance or to make conforming amendments to the code in order to fit in with whatever IESBA determine. And lastly, just to mention, there was some concern that if disclosing something was treated as a PI, and the circumstance that was highlighted was if the only rationale for treating something as a PI would be self-evidently because it was about to become a PI, and that in some way was disclosing confidential future plans of the entity, then it would not be appropriate for the auditor to be making that disclosure and therefore, if you like, breaching that client confidence. So client confidence would trump it in those cases, but in other cases, there isn't an exemption. So I can just pass back to Andy. Next slide.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, the next, thank you. So the effective dates, as mentioned, I believe I mentioned earlier, but is very effectively laid out on this slide here. The NAS and fees projects have an effective date of December 15th of this year, of 2022, whereas the PI project has an effective date of 2 years after that. And that's to further allow the local bodies to refine the PI definition as mentioned, so that the additional dimensions of the NES and fees projects can be rationally worked in with the firms. As Mike just mentioned, and as we've mentioned many times, our sibling board, the IEESB, is fast tracking their work on the disclosure in the auditor's report, and their aim is to have any potential revisions to ISA 700, the auditor's report, will be effective also on by December 15th, 2024. We understand as mentioned, we understand the adoption process take time, and the national standard setters and local bodies have already commenced their engagement process with this new part of the code. Next slide, please. So upcoming rollout activities, as was mentioned earlier, a PI rollout working group was established in the first quarter of this year by the IESBA to oversee the rollout activities for this project. The working group agrees that the focus of these activities, at least initially, needs to be on assisting local bodies with defining the PI categories at a local level. And to that extent, we're going to have many areas, such as the global webinar, such as we're doing now, perhaps, or additional global webinars, short videos, infographics, Q&A. We're in the process of drafting a Q&A for publication that will address many issues that we hear people would like us to address. And also we will be considering the jurisdictional PI definitions database, and we'll have also outreaches to regional or jurisdictional outreaches to around the globe that will focus in on various sectors of the world to help with the onboarding and rollout of this new standard. So I'm going to pass it back to Geoff as we go to the next slide, please, to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Mike, for an excellent overview of the PI revisions. There's certainly a lot of information there and almost coming to the hour already, but just want to let everyone know that the presentation is recorded and will be uploaded to our website and our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel in the next day or so. So please stay tuned for those. We do have time for a few questions. First, we have a couple of questions on sustainability. Obviously, it's very, I guess, topical issue for all standard setters. And we're obviously working very closely with all the global standard setters on these issues. So the first question, perhaps if I could direct the question to Andy, is what about entities if the business activities have significant impact on the environment? Should they be treated as PIs? And then a related question, I think you can answer that all at the same time, is that can the sustainability objectives be considered as a basis to determine if an entity is a PI in accordance with the code, of course?
Sure. No, thank you, Geoff, and that is a good question, and we will also address this in our Q&A. As the international and independent standards under Part 4A of the code deal with audits and reviews of financial statements, and the overarching objectives that we described in 408 and 410 is the focus on the financial health and not on other aspects of the entity, such as its performance on ESG matters or how well it provides services to the public and the efficacy of the products they produce directly. To the extent those impact financial health, then those do come into play. So there might be a high interest in, and is a high interest in, a public interest in environmental impact of the business or activities for certain entities. Such interest does not necessarily translate into the interest in those entities' financial condition. That is, their financial success or failure may not draw a significant, may not be directly tied to their financial interest, but to the extent it the focus of the standard is on the financial condition as described. But just to also, while we're here on this, the IESBA has recognized the rapid growth in the demand for sustainability reporting and assurance, and has prioritized this. In fact, in the first quarter, a sustainability working group was formed by the IESBA chair to conduct fact-finding and to lay the groundwork for IESBA's standard-setting response to sustainability area. And we'll continue to monitor development of sustainability assurance and consider, if appropriate, to expand it for additional requirements in the PI area. But at this point, the focus, again, as laid out in paragraphs 10 and 8, is on the financial condition and the factors of financial failure of the entity.
Thank you, Andy. Next, I'm going to direct your next question to Mike, and it's on the definition of publicly traded entity and its connectivity with the extant term listed entity. In the new definition of publicly traded entity, in the glossary, there's a description, which is an example of a listed entity is defined by relevant securities law or regulation is an example of publicly traded entity. I suppose the question would be, are all listed entities under the extant code scoped in as publicly traded entities? And there was also a question about what about, for example, vanity or convenience listings?
And I'm not quite sure I understand what a vanity or convenience listing is, but I'm certainly conscious, for example, again, in the UK environment, there are some group situations where a subsidiary of an entity may have listed debt and listed only for the purpose of it then falls within some of the particular tax code requirements within the UK, but it's all held intra-group. And certainly there are provisions in the UK codes at the moment that allow that not to be regarded as public interest entity. So it was one of the reasons we went for public traded entity was to allow, if you like, local bodies to express that sort of refinement, which would not mean that in absolutely every single circumstance of a listed security, if that was not traded and clearly had no intention to trade, would it need to be caught by the local definition as they refined it?
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think we have time for maybe one last question, and we're just going to go over that for a minute or two. So please bear with us if that's okay. This is a question, I'll open it to either Mike or Andy. This is a question about, I guess, the newer types of instruments, particularly cryptocurrencies, whether the requirement to consider, for deposit-taking institutions to be scoped in as PI as a mandatory category, would this include the new and developing cryptocurrencies? So I'll throw it out to either Mike or Andy.
I was going to say the disadvantage of throwing it out to both of us is you'll get neither of us answering it, but I'll have a quick go. When we looked at cryptocurrency, I think the problem you've got is that it means so many different things to different people and so many different players are now engaged in it, and how many of them does it actually impact their financial statements? Because we're back to, given the overriding objective is looking at the financial condition of a particular company or entity, how does the cryptocurrency impact on that? So there are some exchanges where the auditor carrying out a financial statement audit would not necessarily be covering the operational aspects of the service that that exchange was providing to its ultimate customers, because those wouldn't be reflected in the financial statements, but it would be the operational aspects that actually would be, if anything, the public interest concern. So we've deliberately not tried to encapsulate all of that within the code at the moment. If particular markets and things develop in particular countries, again, that's where we'd be looking to local bodies to start to build on that. And we may look at it in due course or sorry, we may, the IESBA may, I'm no longer part of that, but the IESBA may look at that in due course, I think.
Thanks, Mike. Did you want to add anything, Andy?
No, that's a terrific
Okay.
answer. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you both. Look, I think it's time. The hour is up already, but I do want to remind our participants that the PI Rollout Working Group is working on a range of rolled out activities, and we've recognized that obviously the focus for these revisions really need to be on helping on the local bodies refining or more clearly defining the PI definition at the local level. So that's why we've planned our activities on that basis. And with that in mind, if you missed the opportunity to ask your questions, or you want to find out more about how it works locally, as Andy had mentioned earlier, we will be looking at organizing a number of outreaches at the regional or jurisdictional level. Another thing that we really want to do is to have that open forum for national standard setters to have the opportunity to share views or challenges and learnings. So we want to open it up to the national standard setters as well, and a range of other activities. And as we reach out to local bodies, I think we'll be able to even fine tune our responses and perhaps at the local level help them to define the PI definition at the local level. So once again, thank you so much, particularly to Andy and Mike for giving up their very precious time to present today on the PI definition. And thank you everyone who's attended. Really appreciate your time and thank you. And once again, the presentation will be uploaded in the next day or so. And please visit our websites for any other developments and materials that we might put up over the next few months. Thank you and have a great day. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening again. Goodbye.